When people talk about the JonBenét Ramsey case, they usually ask one question: who did it? But there's another question that matters just as much and often gets ignored. How was the evidence handled? Because before this case became a debate, before it became a media spectacle, it was an investigation. And from the very beginning, that investigation was compromised. Tonight, this is not about suspects. It's not about theories. It's about how evidence was lost, altered, or rendered unreliable, and how that shaped everything that came after. On the morning JonBenét was reported missing, police responded to what they believed was a kidnapping. The home was not secured as a crime scene. Friends were invited over for support. People gathered in the kitchen. Food was prepared. Rooms were entered and exited repeatedly. From an evidence standpoint, this matters immediately. Every person sheds fibers. Every person, every touch transfers material. Every step alters context. At the time, law enforcement did not yet know that they were dealing with a homicide. But evidence doesn't wait for certainty. Once a scene is altered, it can't be restored. There was a ransom note, and it was discovered inside the home. It was unusually long. It referenced specific details, and it shaped how the situation was understood almost instantly. Investigators initially treated the case as an active kidnapping. That assumption influenced everything: how the house was managed, what evidence was prioritized, what evidence was unintentionally overlooked. Early assumptions matter, because when they're wrong, they don't just delay answers. They redirect the entire investigation, and that's what happened here. Hours later, after they found that ransom note, hours later, JonBenét's father, he went to the basement and he found her body. He carried her body upstairs. Now, this isn't an accusation, but from an investigative standpoint, it was catastrophic. The original position of the body was lost. Environmental context is destroyed. Potential fibers and trace evidence were transferred. Once evidence is moved, information just disappears. And that information can never be recovered. DNA. It's been one of the most discussed elements of this case. But context matters. In the mid-1990s, DNA technology was limited. Databases were small. Touch DNA was poorly understood. Mixed samples were extremely difficult to interpret. Some samples were incomplete. Some were degraded. Some could not exclude innocent explanations. DNA existed, but the ability to fully analyze it did not. And by the time the technology had advanced enough, the evidence was already decades old. Handwriting analysis produced disagreement. Fibers raised possibilities, not conclusions. Timelines conflicted. Nothing aligned cleanly. This is what investigative breakdown looks like. Not a lack of effort, but a loss of clarity caused by early contamination and missing context. When evidence doesn't converge, cases don't move forward. They stall. That note, that ransom note, they had several experts, handwriting experts, analyze the handwriting. And nobody could agree that who wrote the letter. Some people were saying it was the mom, it's the dad. That ransom note, it was specific. They wanted $180,000 ransom. It was a long letter. $180,000 is what he made on his bonus that year. So yeah, specific details were there, but by that time, who knows who touched this letter? And they couldn't agree on the handwriting. So that was one thing. So the DNA was crucial, and the evidence having to stay where it was is crucial. So looking back, it's easy to ask, why did they let this happen? This answer is uncomfortable. This was not a modern crime scene response. Protocols were different. Training was different. And once the scene was compromised, there's no reset. Mistakes made in the first hours became permanent. No later investigation, no matter how thorough, could undo them. As the investigation struggled, media attention intensified. The media didn't cause the evidence failures. It magnified the evidence failures. Once public narratives formed, reassessing early decisions became harder. Not because investigators didn't want to, but because scrutiny made course correction difficult. By then, the damage was already done. So before we end, it's important to understand what cases like this actually leave behind. When evidence is compromised, it doesn't just affect an investigation in the moment. It shapes everything that follows. Questions multiply, confidence erodes, and uncertainty becomes permanent. In the JonBenét Ramsey case, the mystery isn't defined only by what we don't know. It's defined by what can never be known again. The first hours mattered more than anyone realized. Once people moved through the house, cooked meals, and altered the environment, the investigation crossed a line it could never step back over. Once the body was moved, critical context was gone forever. Once evidence aged beyond the limits of available technology, opportunities quietly closed. None of this required bad intentions. It required uncertainty, normal human reactions, and systems unprepared for what they were facing. Justice rarely fails in one dramatic moment. It fails through accumulation, through small decisions made under pressure, through assumptions that seem reasonable at the time, and through evidence that slowly loses its voice. By the time everyone understood what had been lost, it was already too late to recover it. That's why this case remains unsolved, not because the truth doesn't exist, but because the path to it was damaged early and never fully repaired. JonBenét Ramsey was a child. Before the headlines, before the debates, before the theories. And the greatest mystery here may not be who was responsible, but how much truth slipped away before anyone realized it needed protecting. This has been A Quiet Mysteries, Quiet Mystery. Thank you for joining me.